First, Ethan said without hesitation. Martha Klein, his mother, was laid to rest while her son lit candles for another woman. We can't make the funeral. Rachel's birthday comes weeks later. Ethan knocked on her estate lawyer's door, asking for help with his mounting debts. Instead, he was handed the revised will, his name crossed out in black ink.
I'm curious, where in the world are you joining us from?
Drop your city or country in the comments and make sure you're subscribed for all the latest updates. Some seats are empty by accident. His was by choice. The chapel smelled faintly of lilies and polished wood, but to Margaret it reeked of absence. She sat in the front pew, a lone figure holding herself together as though every eye in the room were fixed on her composure. The casket rested only a few feet away, lined in white satin, yet her gaze kept straying to the pew on her left, empty. That emptiness was louder than the organ music. It was louder than the minister's steady voice reading scripture. It screamed David's name. Relatives had flown in from all over, some from as far as Oregon and Florida, yet her only son couldn't bother to appear. The sound of hushed voices drifted behind her, threads of judgment weaving a net she could feel tightening around her shoulders. He chose his wife's birthday instead, someone murmured. Unbelievable. Posting pictures no less. Margaret closed her eyes, nails biting into the damp handkerchief wadded in her palm. She forced her face into the mask of stoicism her mother would have wanted, but humiliation burned beneath her skin. The service blurred. Words of remembrance floated by, punctuated by the squeak of pews as people shifted, the sniffle of grief from cousins, the rustle of hymnal. Margaret barely moved, her back straight, jaw tight, as if cracking would make the whispers true, that she'd raised a son who valued champagne toasts over his grandmother's burial. A flash of memory intruded. Her mother, years younger, standing in her kitchen with an apron dusted in flour, holding David on her hip while stirring a pot. "Don't worry, Mags," she had said back then. "We'll raise him together. Boys need strong women around them." The recollection twisted in her chest. Her mother had been more of a parent to David than he realized, driving him to baseball practice, teaching him his prayers, sitting through his sulks and triumphs. To think she wasn't worth a few hours of his time now was unbearable. The minister's voice rose. "We commend her soul into your hands." Margaret bowed her head, but kept her lips pressed shut. Prayer felt impossible when bitterness crowded her lungs. After the final hymn, people filed past the casket, laying roses with trembling fingers. Margaret stood last, touching the wood gently. She whispered so low even she could barely hear, "I'm sorry he didn't come." At the graveside, the September air was brisk, the kind that seeped through black dresses and made widows clutch their shawls tighter. Margaret stood alone as the earth began to fall, the thud of soil on casket sharp as gunfire in her ears. She did not cry. She would not give anyone that satisfaction. Later, back home, she lowered herself onto the couch in her silent living room. Out of habit, she opened her phone. That's when she saw it. David, grinning wide on social media, his wife's birthday cake lit with sparklers, a crowd cheering behind them, champagne flutes raised, his hand curled possessively around his wife's waist, as if the world existed only for their celebration. Each picture felt like a slap. The timestamps aligned perfectly with the funeral service. While she had been clutching a damp handkerchief, he had been raising a glass. Her heart didn't just ache, it calcified. That night, alone in the dim house her mother once filled with warmth, she made herself a promise. She would never forgive what he had done, not because she couldn't, but because he hadn't even tried to care. Weeks later, on a gray afternoon when the air smelled of rain, a knock echoed through Margaret's front door. When she opened it, David stood there with flowers in his hand. He skipped her burial. Now he wanted my hand out. The knock still echoed in Margaret's ears as she opened the door to find David standing on her porch. A bouquet of grocery store lilies hung awkwardly from his hand, stems wrapped in cellophane. His smile was tentative, almost sheepish, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, Mom," he said softly, as though lowering his voice could erase the months of silence. Margaret's chest tightened, but she didn't step aside. She let the cool autumn air pour into the doorway between them. The smell of rain mingled with the faint musk of his cologne, a scent that once reminded her of Christmas visits and hugs in crowded hallways, now soured by betrayal. "You came?" she said flatly. Her words carried no welcome. David cleared his throat. "I should have been there for Grandma. I know, I messed up." He thrust the flowers toward her as if they could plug the hole he'd torn. Margaret accepted them only to avoid letting them fall to the porch. Their petals brushed her wrist, fragile, perfumed, utterly empty. She turned without invitation and walked into the living room, setting the bouquet on the coffee table. David followed like a child trailing a parent, his steps uncertain on the hardwood. The house still smelled faintly of her mother's lavender sachet. Margaret sank into the armchair, spine stiff, while David remained standing, fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. "I've been meaning to call," he began, eyes darting away, "but things have been rough." Margaret's silence pressed against him. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. He had come for something, that much was certain. Finally, he blurted it out. "My business is tanking, Mom. The restaurant's barely hanging on. We've had bad luck, bills piling up. I was hoping maybe you could—" He paused, then forced the word, "Lend me some money." There it was. Not remorse. Not concern for her grief. A request dressed in desperation. Margaret's jaw tightened. Her mother's last words surfaced like a ghost at her shoulder. "Guard what I leave you. Don't let it slip into careless hands." Her throat ached with unspoken fury. "You didn't call me when she passed," she said, voice low. "You didn't come to the service, but you come now for this." David flinched, then tried to recover with a smile too quick, too polished. "I know I screwed up, Mom. I do, but this isn't about me. It's about keeping the family legacy alive. The restaurant, if I lose it, everything we built. Margaret cut in, her eyes narrowing. "Your grandmother built stability. She built sacrifice. What you built were excuses." His face hard. For a moment his mask slipped, revealing the raw panic beneath. "So you're just going to let me drown? After everything I've done for this family?" Margaret's laugh was dry and sharp. "You mean after everything your grandmother did for you?" The silence between them. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the bare branches against the window pane. Inside, the house seemed to shrink, as though holding its breath. David shoved his hands into his pockets, his shoulders sagging. "Just think about it," he muttered. "Please, I wouldn't be asking if I wasn't desperate." Margaret studied him, her son, grown but not grown up, a man who could celebrate with champagne while his grandmother's coffin lowered into the ground. The ache in her chest flared, but beneath it simmered something stronger than pain. She rose slowly, her movements deliberate, and walked past him toward the doorway. Her voice, when it came, was steady as stone. "I'll think about it," she said. David exhaled in relief, mistaking her composure for concession. But as she closed the door behind him, Margaret's eyes drifted to the cedar chest tucked in the corner of the room. Inside waited her mother's diary, pages of warnings she suddenly felt ready to read. "She left me more than money. She left me warning." The cedar chest sat at the foot of Margaret's bed like a silent sentinel, its brass latch dulled with age, its wood polished by decades of care. She hadn't opened it since her mother's passing. For weeks she had skirted around it, as if the chest itself carried too much weight to confront. But tonight, after David's visit, after his plea disguised as reconciliation, the chest seemed to call her name. Margaret knelt on the rug, her fingers trembling as they brushed the lid. The scent of cedar rose the instant she cracked it open, sharp, earthy, familiar. It carried her back to childhood nights, when her mother tucked lavender sachets among folded quilts, always telling her, "One day this will be yours. Take care of it, as you'd take care of me." Inside, neatly stacked envelopes, recipe cards stained with gravy splatters, and leather-bound notebooks, lay like artifacts of another world. Margaret lifted the diary, its cover cracked, pages yellowed at the edges. She opened it carefully, her breath slowing as her mother's neat cursive filled the lines. One entry caught her eye. "David is spoiled, and it worries me. Margaret works too hard to notice how he takes advantage. He grows entitled, expecting the world to bend for him. I fear what greed will make of him when I'm gone. The words struck her like a slap. She remembered that week clearly. David had been 12, sulking because she wouldn't buy him the latest video game. Her mother had scolded her afterward, insisting discipline mattered more than indulgence. Margaret had brushed it off at the time. Now, sitting cross-legged with the diary spread open, the warning felt like prophecy. Her throat tightened, the bitterness she carried from the funeral mixed with sorrow for a boy who once slept curled against his grandmother's shoulder. Her mother had seen the truth years before Margaret admitted it. David's charm was a veneer, polished enough to fool most people, but beneath it lay hunger that could never be satisfied. Tears blurred the ink as she turned the pages. Recipes written in the margins: her mother's chicken pot pie, peach cobbler, meatloaf with extra ketchup sat beside journal entries about weather, neighbors, and prayers for Margaret's future. Between the ordinary lines, sharp observations about David stood out like warnings carved into stone. He lies when it suits him. He blames others for his mistakes. He loves attention more than honesty. Margaret closed her eyes, pressing her palm flat against the page. Her mother wasn't just leaving her memories, she was leaving her armor. The sound of the refrigerator humming filled the silence. Margaret realized she'd been holding her breath. Slowly, she wiped her cheeks, straightened her shoulders, and set the diary on the table beside her. If David wanted money, she would not hand it over blindly. She would test him, see if he could be honest, if even a shred of remorse lingered beneath his desperation. Her gaze lingered on the envelope tucked inside the diary, one her mother had labeled in elegant script, "Will." Margaret ran her fingers across the word, but did not open it. Not yet. Instead, she slid the diary into her purse, the leather cover brushing against her fingers like a pact. When David called the next evening, his tone falsely bright. "Hey Mom, thought maybe we could have dinner sometime this week." Margaret agreed, calmly, evenly, without hint of her true intent. "Yes, David," she said, her voice measured. "Come by Friday evening, I'll make a roast. We can talk." As she hung up, Margaret set the phone beside the diary, its envelope marked Will peeking from the edges. She left it sitting openly on the dining room table, where no guest could possibly miss it. Greed always fails honesty's exam. Friday evening, Margaret set the dining table with care. A polished roast glistened at the center, potatoes crisped at the edges, gravy steaming in its porcelain dish. Candlelight flickered across the mahogany surface, throwing long shadows that made the room feel more like a stage than a home. And at the far end of the table, she placed the diary, its leather cover plain, but the ivory envelope labeled Will protruding just enough to catch the eye. The doorbell rang precisely at 7. David walked in with practiced cheer, his smile too wide, his hug too quick. "Smells amazing in here," he said, hanging his jacket on the chair without waiting for her to offer. Margaret studied him quietly. His eyes darted around the room, cataloging details the way gamblers scan a deck for aces. When his gaze landed on the diary, it lingered for half a beat too long. They sat. She carved the roast, her motions deliberate, each slice placed neatly on his plate before she served herself. Conversation wobbled at first, safe topics, weather, traffic, the football season, but beneath his small talk Margaret sensed calculation. He laughed too quickly, nodded too eagerly, as if rehearsing warmth. Midway through dinner she set her fork down and asked, her tone deceptively casual, "Do you regret missing your grandmother's funeral?" The question landed like a stone in water. David froze, knife suspended above the roast. His mouth opened, then closed. Finally he gave a short laugh that rang hollow. "You know how it is, bad timing. I couldn't just leave Sarah on her birthday. She would have never forgiven me." Margaret's eyes stayed on him, unblinking. "And you thought I would forgive you?" He shifted in his chair, face tightening. "I'm here now, aren't I? Trying to make things right." But even as he spoke, his fingers drummed lightly against the table, nervous, restless. His eyes flicked again toward the diary. He was answering, but his focus wasn't on her grief. It was on the envelope. Margaret excused herself to the kitchen to fetch more gravy. She didn't need to watch him directly. She knew him too well. Still, as she lingered in the doorway, her reflection in the glass-fronted cabinet allowed her a perfect view. David's hand hovered. His breathing changed, slower, deliberate. His fingers slid across the tablecloth toward the diary. A pause, as if listening for footsteps. Then, with a swift motion, he tugged the envelope free and tried to slip it beneath his thigh. Margaret returned in silence, gravy boat in hand. She set it down without a word. Then, with calm precision, she reached across and plucked the envelope from his lap. David jerked back, his cheeks flushing crimson. I was just looking at it," he stammered. "Were you?" Margaret asked evenly, sliding the envelope back into place. "Or were you stealing from your grandmother's?" His eyes flared with anger, then softened into a practiced pout. "Mom, come on. Don't make this bigger than it is. I was curious, that's all." Her voice cut sharper than the carving knife. Curiosity doesn't hide things under the table. David pushed back his chair, frustration spilling over. "Why are you always against me? You think the worst of everything I do. Maybe that's why I messed up in the first place, because you never trusted me." Margaret held his gaze, steady and unflinching. In the flicker of candlelight, she saw the boy her mother had warned her about, now grown into a man who mistook manipulation for love. She inhaled slowly, steadying the quake in her chest. "You've just failed the only test that mattered." The room crackled with tension, roast cooling on the plates, candles burning low. Margaret leaned forward, her voice a whisper sharpened into steel. "So tell me, David, what else have you been hiding?" He wanted secrets. I gave him truth. The air between them thickened, heavy as storm clouds about to burst. The untouched roast sat cooling, candle wax dripping in slow rivers, the silence broken only by the tick of the old mantel clock. Margaret's fingers closed around the diary, pulling it back toward her side of the table like a shield. David's jaw worked as if chewing words he couldn't swallow. Finally he snapped, "I wasn't stealing. I just wanted to know what was in there. You act like everything belongs to you." Margaret's lips pressed thin. "Everything in this house belonged to your grandmother, and she left it to me, because she knew who could be trusted." His face flushed a dangerous red. "Trusted? You mean worshipped? You were always her favorite. Don't think I didn't notice." The accusation cut deeper than he knew. Margaret steadied herself, recalling all those years when her mother had stood in the gap, babysitting, packing lunches, attending school plays Margaret couldn't leave work for. David had soaked up her mother's devotion like sunshine, but now he twisted it into a blade. "You missed her funeral, David," she said, voice sharp but trembling underneath. "That wasn't about favoritism, that was about your choice." His fist slammed against the table, rattling the dishes. "Don't you dare judge me. You think I had it so easy? You think I didn't notice you cared more about her than me?" The outburst startled even him. His chest heaved, eyes wild, as though years of buried resentment had finally clawed free. Margaret rose slowly, dignity stiffening her spine. "No, what I cared about was raising you right. What she cared about was loving you when you made it impossible. And how did you repay her? By throwing a party while we laid her to rest." David's mouth opened, then snapped shut. He looked suddenly smaller, caught between rage and shame, but the shame didn't last. His features hardened into defiance. "You never understand," he muttered, shoving back his chair. "You sit up there on your high horse, acting like I'm the disappointment. Maybe I am, but don't forget you're the one who failed me first." Margaret felt the sting, but she didn't flinch. She had carried guilt for years, missed school pickups, overtime shifts, dinners eaten alone. But she also knew truth when it stood before her in its ugliest form. Her mother's warnings rang in her ears. He lies when it suits him. He blames others for his mistakes. She placed her hands flat on the table. "No, David, I didn't fail you. I gave you every chance. Grandma gave you more than that. Love, time, sacrifice. And you still chose yourself. For a long beat he stared at her, lips trembling as though words battled for release. But in the end all that came was silence. Margaret's voice dropped, steady as a gavel. Now I choose me. The words landed with finality, echoing in the hollow between them. She reached for the diary and tucked it beneath her arm, a visible sign of where her loyalty lay. David scoffed, trying to recover bravado. Fine, keep your little box of secrets, but don't come crying to me when you realize you've got no one else. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair and stormed toward the door. The slam reverberated through the quiet house, rattling picture frames on the wall. Margaret stood alone in the dining room, her pulse racing but her stance firm. For the first time since the funeral, she felt her grief had shifted into something stronger, resolve. She had drawn a line. She exhaled slowly, extinguished the candles, and whispered into the darkened room, "This was your choice, David." But even as she spoke, she couldn't shake the feeling that he would be back, and next time he wouldn't come asking. He'd come demand. Sometimes peace is the loudest punishment. The house grew quieter after David's outburst, so quiet that even the ticking mantel clock felt intrusive. Days blurred into one another, each morning beginning with the same ritual. Margaret brewed coffee, set 2 cups on the table out of old habit, and then carried only one to her seat. The empty chair across from her stared back like a wound that wouldn't close. David didn't call. He didn't text. Not a word of apology. Not even another demand. At first, the silence unnerved her. Every creak of the porch boards made her check the window, half expecting his silhouette to appear. But as the days stretched into weeks, the absence shifted. It no longer felt like waiting. It began to feel like freedom. One chilly afternoon, Margaret drove to the cemetery. The autumn wind swept leaves across the gravel path as she knelt at her mother's grave. Her fingers traced the carved letters, rough beneath her skin. "I did as you'd want," she whispered, voice trembling but certain. "I stood tall. I told him no." The breeze lifted her veil of hair, almost like an approving touch. She stayed until the sun dipped low, shadows lengthening across the rows of stones, then left with a calm she hadn't felt in months. At home she filled her evenings differently. Instead of scrolling through David's social media or rereading the diary with tears, she started volunteering at the church kitchen. She ladled soup, sliced bread, and handed out steaming bowls to strangers whose gratitude shone brighter than anything her son had shown her in years. "Thank you, ma'am," a man with weathered hands told her one night, eyes glistening as he accepted his tray. The words pierced her heart, not with pain, but with healing. Here among people who had nothing, kindness flowed freely. It reminded her that her worth wasn't defined by her son's neglect. Yet the silence wasn't without ache. Nights stretched long. She'd lie awake listening to the groan of the old house, the creak of floorboards settling, the distant bark of dogs down the street. She'd think of David as a boy, running barefoot through the yard, calling for her with laughter that once filled every corner of these rooms. That boy felt like a ghost now, and the man he had become was harder to forgive than the silence itself. Still, she clung to her mother's words, written in looping script inside the diary, "Stand tall, even when you stand alone." Then one gray evening, as she wiped down the counters after a long shift at the church, headlights swept across her driveway. A car door slammed, her stomach clenched before she even looked. Through the blinds, she saw him, David, pacing at the porch like a storm contained in a single body. His movements were sharper this time, impatient, fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. Margaret's pulse quickened. The last time he had stood here, he carried flowers. Now his hands were empty. Empty, except for the anger written all over his face. The pounding knock rattled the front door, harder, angrier than before. Margaret froze in the kitchen, heart thudding, knowing this visit wasn't about reconciliation, it was about war. A son's demand felt like a stranger's threat. The pounding rattled the windows before Margaret finally opened the door. David shoved past her without waiting for permission, his boots dragging dirt across the rug her mother had once cherished. His face was tight, jaw clenched, eyes sharp with something darker than desperation. "You've had your fun playing judge," he snapped, slamming his fist against the dining table. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the house. "Now it's time you listen to me." Margaret shut the door slowly, steadying her breath. "Lower your voice, David. This is my home." He leaned forward, hands pressed flat against the wood, his body shaking with restrained fury. "Then start acting like family. I'm your son, and I'm telling you I deserve a share of that inheritance. Grandma would have wanted me to have it too." Her stomach tightened, but she kept her voice calm. "What she wanted is written. It wasn't for you, it wasn't for you, it was for me." David's eyes flashed. "That's your version. You've always twisted her words to suit yourself." The accusation stung, but Margaret didn't flinch. She remembered her mother's diary entries, each one a breadcrumb leading to this very moment. He lies when it suits him. He blames others for his mistakes. "I'm not twisting anything," she said firmly. "I am honoring her wish, and those wishes did not include handing money to a son who missed her funeral to drink champagne." His hand shot out, sweeping a glass across the table. It shattered against the floor, shards skittering into the shadows. Margaret flinched but stood her ground. "You think you're strong because you can say no?" he hissed. "Well, guess what? I'm done asking. If you don't give me my share, I'll contest the will. I'll drag you through court, and everyone will see who you really are." The words hit like cold steel. Margaret's pulse quickened, but fear gave way to something steadier, fiercer. She had endured whispers at the funeral, nights of loneliness, and the sting of betrayal. But this threat ignited fire instead of weakness. She lifted her chin. "If that's what you want, then do it. But understand this, David, your grandmother's will is ironclad, and dragging me into court won't give you what you're after. It'll only expose what you've become." For a moment, silence stretched. His jaw twitched, his fists clenched until the knuckles white. She almost thought he might strike the wall or worse, her. But then his shoulders slumped, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "You'll regret this." Margaret stepped closer, close enough to smell the faint bitterness of liquor on his breath. "No, Dave, the only thing I regret is believing you'd ever grow into the man she hoped you'd be." The words struck deeper than any slap. He turned abruptly, yanked open the door, and stormed into the night. Margaret stood frozen, heart pounding, until the roar of his engine faded down the street. Only then did she let her knees tremble. She sank into the chair he had abandoned, shards of glass crunching faintly beneath her shoes. Her mother's diary sat where she had left it, edges curled slightly from constant touch. She placed a trembling hand on it, whispering, "Stand tall." Then, with renewed resolve, she reached for the phone and dialed her lawyer. 3 days later, a courier arrived with a thick envelope stamped summons. Margaret tore it open with steady fingers, her eyes scanning the first line. "You are hereby notified." David had made good on his threat. Blood turns to ink when greed files a case. The envelope was heavier than it looked. Margaret carried it from the porch to the kitchen table as if it were loaded with stone. She slid it open with the tip of a butter knife, hands steady though her stomach churned. The legal phrasing was cold, impersonal. "You are hereby summoned, withholding rightful assets, undue influence over the deceased." Her throat tightened. Undue influence. The accusation sliced deep. David wasn't just demanding money now. He was accusing her of twisting her own mother's will. The house seemed to shrink around her. The tick of the clock was suddenly too loud, the walls too close. For a moment, grief surged hot and fresh again. Not for her mother this time, but for the son she no longer recognized. She folded the papers neatly, set them beside the diary, and picked up the phone. Her lawyer, Charles Whitaker, answered on the second ring. "Margaret, I've been expecting this," he said in his measured baritone. David filed, "Didn't he?" "Yes." Her voice cracked only once. "He says I manipulated my mother." Charles exhaled, not surprised. "The will is ironclad. Your mother's capacity was documented thoroughly. Medical evaluations, notarized signatures. He doesn't have a leg to stand on, but he'll try to make noise. That's what people like him do." Margaret's hand brushed the diary. "Then we fight." News of the filing spread quickly. By the next Sunday, whispers rippled through the pews at church. People approached her with cautious sympathy. "I heard about David. I'm so sorry you're going through this," one neighbor murmured. "Family disputes are the worst," said another, eyes downcast but hungry for details. Each word was both balm and blade. Sympathy softened her isolation, but the gossip felt like a public trial before the real one had even begun. Margaret learned to lift her chin higher, to walk into the grocery store without bowing under the weight of curious stares. Her mother's last line in the diary replayed in her mind like a hymn. At night she sat at the dining table with Charles on speakerphone, combing through every detail of the estate. Receipts, letters, bank ledgers, all lined up like soldiers ready for inspection. Each document reminded her that her mother had trusted her, not just with possessions, but with legacy. Still, the ache lingered. To defend her mother's memory in court meant dragging private pain into public record. Margaret stared at the summons one last time before sliding it into a folder. She whispered to the empty room, "You thought I'd bow, David. You thought wrong." The hearing date was set for 3 weeks out. Margaret circled it on her calendar in bold red ink, her hand pressing so firmly the marker bled through the page. On the morning of the first hearing, as she buttoned her black blazer, her reflection in the mirror looked older, sterner, but unbroken. When she stepped outside, the courthouse loomed in the distance, its stone columns stark against the sky. Margaret squared her shoulders, clutching her mother's diary like a talisman. It was time to face her son, not at her doorstep, but before the law. "They thought I'd tremble. I testified." The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish, the kind of sterile air that clung to history. Margaret walked through the metal detector, clutching her mother's diary in her purse like a lifeline. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, steady, measured, though inside her chest, her heart rattled like loose change in a tin can. The courtroom itself was colder than she expected. Oak benches lined with restless bodies, neighbors, distant cousins, curious onlookers filled the gallery. Whispers fluttered when they saw her enter. Margaret lifted her chin and kept her gaze forward. David sat at the opposite table, clean-shaven, dressed in a suit that didn't quite hide the dark circles beneath his eyes. His wife, Sarah, perched beside him like a sentinel, her expression sharpened into steel. Neither looked at Margaret when she passed. Judge Reynolds, a stern man with silver hair, banged the gavel. Case number 2137, David Harrington versus Margaret Harrington, contest of will. The formality struck Margaret like ice, reducing her grief into a case file. She folded her hands in her lap, spine straight. David's attorney rose first, pacing before the bench. "Your Honor, my client believes the will in question does not reflect the deceased's true intent. We argue that Margaret Harrington exerted undue influence during the drafting process." Margaret's lawyer, Charles, stood with calm precision. "The evidence will show that the deceased, Evelyn Harper, acted of sound mind and free will. Her wishes were clear and legally documented. We intend to prove these claims are not only unfounded, but motivated by financial desperation." Margaret caught the flicker of David's glare as those last words landed. The judge nodded. "Proceed." David was called to the stand. He adjusted his tie nervously, then launched into a rehearsed story. "Grandma always promised to take care of me. She told me I'd have security, that I'd be part of everything she left behind. But in her final days, Mom," he jabbed a finger toward Margaret, "kept her away from me. She made sure I couldn't visit without her there, always controlling the conversations." Margaret's stomach tightened. The lie twisted so cleanly it almost sounded true. Then Sarah took the stand. Her voice was cool, deliberate. "David was devastated when he learned the will excluded him. He loved his grandmother deeply. He never would have missed the funeral if it hadn't been for Margaret making him feel unwanted." The words landed like poison, and murmurs rippled through the gallery. When it was Margaret's turn, she walked to the witness stand with deliberate steps. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore the oath, and faced the court. Did you manipulate your mother into leaving you the estate? The opposing lawyer asked, his tone sharp. Margaret's voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly in her lap. No, my mother knew her own mind better than anyone. She was strong-willed until her last breath. She made her choice, and she trusted me to honor it. Charles approached with a stack of documents. Your Honor, we submit medical evaluations from Dr. Lawson, who assessed Evelyn Harper's cognitive state 6 weeks prior to signing the will. Results show no impairment. In addition, we submit notarized affidavits from the witnesses present at the signing. Judge Reynolds studied the papers, eyes narrowing slightly. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Then came the turning point. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Harrington, records submitted to this court indicate significant outstanding debts under your name, gambling losses, unpaid loans. Before we continue, we require a deeper investigation into whether this contest of will is an attempt to resolve personal financial troubles rather than a legitimate claim. The gallery buzzed, whispers sharp and fast. Sarah's face David's jaw clenched as he gripped the armrest of his chair hard enough to whiten his knuckles. Margaret sat still, but inside, a flicker of vindication warmed her chest. The gavel struck. This hearing is adjourned until the investigation is complete. As the crowd dispersed, David's eyes found hers at last, cold, furious, and full of promises she knew were anything but empty. Sometimes truth is buried in bank statements. The courthouse files became David's undoing before Margaret even said another word. Investigators moved quickly, prying open every corner of his financial life. Margaret didn't have to ask for updates. Charles called her regularly, his tone clipped, professional, but carrying an undercurrent of satisfaction. Credit cards maxed out, personal loans unpaid. He's been juggling debt for years, Charles reported, one evening as Margaret sat in her quiet kitchen. Papers rustled on his end of the line. And here's the kicker. He borrowed against other people's property, signed as guarantor, then walked away when the payments came due. Margaret pressed her palm to her forehead. So he's been stealing without calling it theft. Exactly, Charles said, and the court will see it. This isn't about family legacy, this is about covering a mountain of bad bets. The words lingered long after she hung up. Margaret sat with her mother's diary open in front of her, eyes scanning the familiar script. Greed will hollow him out if you let it. Evelyn's warning had been precise, almost prophetic. At the next hearing, the investigators' findings were laid bare. Margaret sat poised as a clerk read aloud the ledger of debts. Thousands in unpaid credit, casino markers from Atlantic City, bounced checks, property lines. Each line chipped away at the facade David had worked so hard to maintain. Murmurs swept through the gallery. Even Sarah's composure cracked. Her eyes darted between the judge and her husband, her lips pressed into a thin, angry line. David sat rigid, sweat glistening at his temple. He tried to sneer, to act unbothered, but his foot tapped violently against the floor, betraying him. The judge's gavel rapped once for silence. It appears this contest has less to do with rightful inheritance and more to do with evading personal accountability. We'll continue proceedings, but Mr. Harrington, know that your financial dealings will weigh heavily against your credibility. Margaret didn't smile, though a quiet surge of vindication pulsed through her chest. For once the lies weren't working for him. That night, she sat by her mother's grave, a thermos of coffee in her hands, bundled in her wool. It's coming to light, Mama, she whispered into the crisp night air. All of it. You were right to warn me. Yet the victory felt hollow. She had wanted her son to grow into a man his grandmother could be proud of. Instead, he was unraveling before strangers in a courtroom. Her sympathy fought with her anger. One moment she longed to reach out to remind him he was still her child. The next, she saw only the man who had threatened her, who had tried to pocket her mother's will. Weeks passed as the court slogged through motion. Margaret found small comforts, neighbors dropping casseroles at her doorstep, the steady encouragement of the church kitchen. Charles's calm assurances. Still, each night she locked her doors twice. unease pressing in with the darkness. Her unease proved justified. One night, headlights swept across her driveway long past midnight. Margaret peered through the blinds, heart hammering. David's car sat crooked, engine idling. He stumbled out, his silhouette weaving, fists balling and unballing at his side. He paced up the drive, muttering curses she could barely catch through the glass. Then his voice rose, carrying through the still neighborhood. "You ruined me, Mom. You think you're better than me. You'll pay for this." Neighbors' porch lights flicked on, curtains shifted, phones died. Margaret stood at her front door, unflinching, as his shadow loomed large against the siding. Red and blue lights flared at the end of the street. Police sirens wailed closer as David bellowed one last threat. Margaret gripped the doorknob, her heart torn between fear and defiance. This wasn't just desperation anymore. It was rage, and it was coming for her. Grief made me quiet. His rage made me strong. The flashing lights painted Margaret's house in violent strokes of red and blue. David's voice boomed through the night, echoing off the quiet houses around them. "You think you can take everything from me," he shouted, his words slurred with alcohol. "You think you're better than me." Margaret stood in the doorway, porch light glowing above her. She didn't step out, but she didn't retreat either. She let him see her calm, unshaken, a figure carved from the same steel her mother had carried through every hardship. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, phones raised, whispers carrying through the night. She could feel their eyes, but she kept hers locked on Dave. "You're still my son," she said softly, almost to herself, though her lips barely moved. The words weren't meant for him. They were for the boy she used to know, the one long buried under the man who now staggered and spat venom at her doorstep. David pounded his fist against the porch railing, the wood groaning under the blow. "You ruined me, all because you can't let go of her money." The sirens drew closer. Tires screeched as a cruiser pulled into the driveway, gravel scattering beneath the wheel. Two officers leapt out, voices sharp and commanding. "Sir, step back from the property." David turned on them, wild-eyed, arms flailing. "She's the thief. She stole from me." His words cracked into something almost childlike, a tantrum wrapped in a man's fury. The officers closed in. Margaret didn't flinch as they wrestled him back, cuffing his wrists while he struggled and cursed. His shouts rang hollow now, desperation masquerading as defiance. "You'll regret this, Mom," he screamed as they dragged him toward the cruiser. "You hear me? You'll regret this." Margaret's heart splintered, but she stayed rooted to the porch. The cold night air cut through her sweater, but she felt oddly warm, as if a fire burned steady inside her chest. A neighbor, Mrs. Langley, shuffled closer from across the street, robe pulled tight around her. "You okay, Margaret?" she whispered, voice trembling. Margaret nodded once, eyes fixed on the cruiser where David now sat slumped, face pressed to the glass, still shouting though the words were muffled. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice cracked on the last syllable. The officers gave her a quick rundown. Charges of public disturbance, possible restraining order if she chose to file. She thanked them, her voice polite, steady, as though discussing weather instead of her son being hauled off in handcuffs. When the cruiser pulled away, the night fell silent again. The neighbors drifted back into their houses. Margaret remained on the porch, staring into the darkness where his taillights had vanished. She whispered into the stillness, her breath visible in the cold. "You're still my son, but love doesn't mean I'll let you destroy me." Inside, she locked the door and leaned against it, her body trembling now that the adrenaline ebbed. She pressed her palms flat to the wood, as though holding back a flood. The house seemed unbearably quiet, after the chaos, but Margaret found her footing in that silence. She knew tomorrow would bring headlines, gossip, maybe pity. None of it mattered. What mattered was that she had faced him, and she hadn't broken. Morning light crept through the blinds. Hours later, Margaret dressed in her black blazer once more, eyes hollow but steady. Today the judge would deliver the verdict. The question wasn't whether she could survive her son's rage. It was whether she could survive his final strike in court. Law doesn't bend for tantrums. The courthouse was crowded the morning of the verdict. the hum of conversation thick as Margaret walked down the aisle toward her seat. She wore the same black blazer she had worn for every hearing, her armor of choice. Her mother's diary was tucked into her purse, the familiar weight grounding her as she passed through rows of neighbors and strangers who had come to witness the family unravel. David sat at the opposite table, shoulders slumped, eyes ringed with exhaustion. His suit looked wrinkled, his tie crooked, as though even he had stopped pretending. Sarah sat beside him, arms folded, gaze fixed on the judge's bench instead of her husband. Judge Reynolds entered, robes swaying, and the room fell silent, his voice carried with unyielding gravity as he spoke. This court has reviewed the evidence, including testimony, medical records, and financial documentation. His gaze swept the room, briefly pausing on David before moving on. The will drafted by the late Evelyn Harper is valid and legally binding. Margaret Harrington is hereby confirmed as the sole heir. Gasps rippled through the gallery. David's face drained of color. Sarah's jaw clenched. Margaret sat still, her heart hammering, though she forced her expression to remain composed. The judge continued, "The claims of undue influence are unsubstantiated. Furthermore, this court notes the discovery of significant debts under the petitioner's name. While these are not the primary matter of this trial, they are now part of the public record." The gavel struck once, sealing the decision. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Margaret's lungs filled slowly, as though she'd been underwater and only now allowed to breathe. At the defense table, David's mask cracked. He slumped forward, hands covering his face. Sarah leaned away from him, her eyes icy, her body language screaming distance. Whispers erupted across the gallery, a tide of speculation and judgment washing over them. Margaret rose. Her steps toward the door were measured, deliberate. She didn't look back, though she could feel David's stare burning into her spine. Each stride felt like reclaiming ground she had lost long ago, not just to him, but to grief, humiliation, silence. Outside, the autumn air hit her like a blessing. Reporters lingered near the courthouse steps, but she brushed past them. What caught her off guard wasn't the cameras, but the small gathering of townsfolk who had followed her out. "You stood strong," one man said, tipping his hat. "Good for you, Margaret," another woman whispered, eyes shining. "You honored your mother," someone else added. Their words wrapped around her like a shawl, not pity but respect. She gave a small nod, swallowing the knot in her throat. She wanted to go home, to sit in her quiet kitchen and finally let the weight slide off her shoulders. But when she reached her porch later that evening, something unexpected lay waiting. A letter tucked beneath the welcome mat. Her name scrawled across the envelope in David's familiar handwriting. Margaret froze, the paper trembling in her hand. She hadn't heard from him since the night of his drunken rage. The sight of his words inked instead of shouted sent a chill down her spine. She carried the letter inside, sat at the table and stared at it without opening. The verdict was over, but her son's voice had found another way back into her home. Apologies can be inked. Change must be lived. The envelope sat on the kitchen table all night. Margaret passed it again and again, each time resisting the urge to tear it open. She made tea, folded laundry, even sat with the television murmuring in the background, but her eyes always returned to that square of paper. By morning she could no longer wait. She slid a paring knife under the seal and unfolded the letter inside. David's handwriting sprawled across the page, hurried and uneven, as though written in one restless burst. "Mom, I know you hate me. Maybe you should. I've made mistakes too many to count. The court forced me into They say I need to confront my demons. Maybe they're right. Maybe you're right. I don't know who I am anymore, except a man who keeps losing. I'm sorry for what I said. I'm sorry for missing Grandma's funeral. I'm sorry for all of it. Please, don't give up on me. I just need a chance to prove I can be better." The words blurred as tears welled in Margaret's eyes. She pressed the page flat, her fingertips smudging the ink where his pen had pressed too hard. Part of her wanted to believe every word. She remembered the boy who once drew her Mother's Day cards in crayon, who used to kiss her cheek before school. For a heartbeat she let herself feel that ache, the longing for the son she used to have. But another part of her, the part tempered by funerals, courtrooms, and midnight threats, remained wary. She had seen apologies before, each one followed by the same cycle: charm, promise, betrayal. Ink was easy. Change was hard. She folded the letter carefully and slipped it inside her mother's diary. "If you were here," she whispered to the cedar chest at the foot of her bed, "what would you tell me? To forgive, or to guard my heart?" The silence of the house offered no answer, only the faint creak of settling beams. Later that week, Margaret carried the letter with her to the grief support group she had begun attending. The community hall smelled faintly of coffee and old wood polish. Folding chairs circled in the center, each filled with someone carrying their own invisible weight. Widows, widowers, parents, siblings, faces marked by loss. When it was her turn to share, she clutched the diary in her lap, the letter tucked in. Her voice was low at first, but grew steadier as she spoke. "My mother raised me to believe in strength. She raised my son too. She gave him more love than he ever knew how to hold. And when she died, he chose not to honor her. Instead, he chose himself." Her throat tightened, but she continued. "Now he says he's sorry. He's written me a letter. And I want to believe him. God knows I do, but I don't know if I can." The circle was silent, but the silence felt supportive rather than judgmental. A woman across from her dabbed her eye. A man with a lined face nodded slowly, as if he understood every syllable. Margaret exhaled, the weight of months lifting slightly from her shoulders. Speaking the truth aloud was different than whispering it into the dark. It was a declaration not of defeat, but of survival. As the meeting ended and chairs scraped against the floor, the group leader approached her with a gentle smile. "Margaret, would you be willing to share your story at next month's gathering? I think others need to hear it." Margaret hesitated, the letter heavy in her. To tell her story publicly meant opening wounds wider, but in the leader's eyes, she saw more than pity, she saw purpose. "My grief became my gift." The church hall smelled faintly of brewed coffee and lemon polish when Margaret stepped inside. Folding chairs formed neat rows this time, not a circle. At the front stood a wooden podium with a small microphone attached, its wire curling down to the floor like a serpent. She clutched her mother's diary against her chest, steadying herself as the crowd settled. The leader introduced her gently. "Tonight Margaret Harrington will share her journey through loss." Applause followed, soft, encouraging, not demanding. Margaret stepped up to the podium, the diary trembling faintly in her hands. For a moment, words caught in her throat. Faces stared back at her, some weathered, some young, all marked by grief's fingerprints. She inhaled deeply, the cedar scent of the diary grounding her. "When my mother died, I thought I knew grief," she began. Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. "What I didn't expect was betrayal layered on top of it. My son, my only child, chose a birthday party over her funeral. And when I thought he couldn't hurt me more, he came asking for her money instead of mourning her memory." Murmurs rippled through the audience, but no one looked away. Eyes glistened, heads nodded. Margaret continued, her voice finding rhythm. "I spent months wondering if I failed him as a mother, if I loved him too little, or too much. But my mother, God bless her, she left me a diary. In her words I found warnings. She saw who he was long before I did, and in her words I also found strength." She opened the diary, reading a line aloud. "Stand tall, even when you stand alone." That's what she wrote. And those words carried me through courtrooms, through neighbors' whispers, through nights when my son banged on my door in anger. A woman in the front row covered her mouth, tears streaking her cheeks. Margaret closed the diary gently. "I can't tell you that grief gets easier, but I can tell you that grief doesn't have to silence you. It can make you stronger." It made me stronger, because I realized my worth isn't tied to who betrays me, it's tied to how I stand in spite of it. For a moment the hall was silent, the weight of her words settling over the crowd. Then applause rose, louder, this time. Not polite, not pitying, respectful. Margaret felt her chest loosen. The applause wasn't for a victim. It was for a survivor. As people lined up afterward to shake her hand, to thank her, to share fragments of their own stories, She felt something she hadn't in months: connection. Each nod, each touch, stitched a little of her heart back together. Then, as the hall began to empty, a man lingered near the back. He was tall, with gray at his temples, and kind eyes that softened when they met hers. When the last of the crowd dispersed, he approached. "Your words tonight," he said quietly. "They reached me, more than I expected." He extended his hand. "Frank, my wife passed 3 years ago. I've been coming here ever since, but I've never heard someone speak with that kind of honesty." Margaret took his hand, surprised by the warmth of it. "Thank you," she said, her voice gentler now. Frank hesitated, then smiled. "I know it's forward, but Thanksgiving's coming up. My daughters are visiting, and they always insist I invite someone from the group. Would you consider joining us? Just so you don't spend the holiday alone." Margaret froze, the invitation hanging in the air like a lifeline she hadn't expected. For years her table had been defined by absence. Now, for the first time, someone was offering her a seat at theirs. "He abandoned me at a funeral. I found a family at a table." The smell of roasted turkey and spiced cider drifted through Frank's house, carrying laughter with it. Margaret stood in the doorway of the dining room, her coat folded neatly over her arm, her heart thudding with the awkwardness of a guest on foreign ground. She hadn't sat at a Thanksgiving table with company in years. Frank's daughters bustled about, arranging bowls of stuffing, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce that glistened under the chandelier. One of them, Lydia, the eldest, looked up with a smile. "Come in, Margaret. Dad says you make a mean peach cobbler. Next year you're on dessert duty." The teasing disarmed her. She laughed softly, setting her purse down on the sideboard. The sound felt unfamiliar but good, like stretching muscles long unused. Frank pulled out a chair for her at the long oak table. Margaret sat smoothing the napkin across her lap, her eyes taking in the scene. The table was crowded, plates passing, silverware clinking, voices overlapping in warmth. For the first time since her mother's funeral, she didn't feel the hollowness of absence pressing against her. As conversation flowed around her, stories about childhood, Thanksgivings, jokes about Frank's overcooked turkeys of the past, Margaret found herself joining in, her voice no longer strained but part of the chorus. Every so often, Frank caught her gaze and offered a quiet smile, steady and kind. The ache for David was still there, a scar that throbbed beneath the surface. But tonight the scar didn't define her. Tonight she belonged. When the meal wound down, Frank raised his glass of cider. "To family," he said. His daughters echoed him, glasses clinking together. Then, unexpectedly, Margaret lifted her own. "To chosen families," she said, her voice strong, carrying down the table. Silence fell for a beat, then nods and murmurs of agreement rippled around her. Frank's eyes warmed, pride and gratitude mingling in his expression. As plates were cleared and laughter lingered, Margaret excused herself for a moment. She slipped into the quiet of the den, where a small writing desk sat tucked beneath a window. From her purse she pulled out her journal, the one she had begun after the court case. After she realized she needed her own words alongside her mother's, she opened to a fresh page, pen poised. For a moment she hesitated, the hum of voices floating in from the dining room. Then she began to write. "1 year ago I buried my mother and lost my son in the same breath. I thought grief would hollow me out. I thought betrayal would finish me. But I was wrong. I lived stronger. I learned that family isn't always blood. It's who shows up, who stays, who cares when it costs them something. Tonight I sat at a table where laughter drowned out loneliness, and I chose life over bitterness." Her hand shook slightly as she signed her name at the bottom. Margaret. She closed the journal gently, slid it back into her purse, and returned to the table. The room glowed with warmth, candles flickering, voices overlapping, the clink of dessert spoons on china. Margaret raised her fork, took a bite of pie and let herself smile. David had once thought her weak, someone he could guilt, manipulate and abandon. But as she looked around the table filled with laughter and love, She knew the truth. She wasn't weak. She had survived, and she had chosen to live stronger. The knock still echoed in Margaret's ears, as she opened the door to find David standing on her porch. A bouquet of grocery store lilies hung awkwardly from his hand, stems wrapped in cellophane. His smile was tentative, almost sheepish, but it didn't reach his eye. "Hey, Mom," he said softly, as though lowering his voice could erase the months of silence. Margaret's chest tightened, but she didn't step aside. She let the cool autumn air pour into the doorway between them. The smell of rain mingled with the faint musk of his cologne, a scent that once reminded her of Christmas visits and hugs in crowded hallways, now soured by betrayal. "You came," she said flatly. Her words carried no welcome. David cleared his throat. "I should have been there for Grandma. I know, I messed up." He thrust the flowers toward her as if they could plug the hole he'd torn. Margaret accepted them only to avoid letting them fall to the porch. Their petals brushed her wrist, fragile, perfumed, utterly empty. She turned without invitation and walked into the living room, setting the bouquet on the coffee table. David followed like a child trailing a parent, his steps uncertain on the hardwood. The house still smelled faintly of her mother's lavender sash. Margaret sank into the armchair, spine stiff, while David remained standing, fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. "I've been meaning to call," he began, eyes darting away, "but things have been rough." Margaret's silence pressed against him. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. He had come for something, that much was certain. Finally he blurted it out. "My business is tanking, Mom. The restaurant's barely hanging on. We've had bad luck, bills piling up. I was hoping maybe you could—" He paused, then forced the word, "lend me some money." There it was, not remorse, not concern for her grief, a request dressed in desperation. Margaret's jaw tightened. Her mother's last words surfaced like a ghost at her shoulder. "Guard what I leave you. Don't let it slip into careless hands." Her throat ached with unspoken fury. "You didn't call me when she passed," she said, voice low. "You didn't come to the service, but you come now for this." David flinched, then tried to recover with a smile too quick, too polished. "I know I screwed up, Mom. I do, but this isn't about me. It's about keeping the family legacy alive. The restaurant, if I lose it, everything we built." Margaret cut in, her eyes narrowing. "Your grandmother built stability. She built sacrifice. What you built were excuses." His face hardened. For a moment his mask slipped, revealing the raw panic beneath. "So you're just going to let me drown, after everything I've done for this family?" Margaret's laugh was dry and sharp. "You mean after everything your grandmother did for you?" The silence between them stretched. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the bare branches against the window pane. Inside, the house seemed to shrink, as though holding its breath. David shoved his hands into his pockets, his shoulders sagging. "Just think about it," he muttered. "Please, I wouldn't be asking if I wasn't desperate." Margaret studied him, her son, grown but not grown up. A man who could celebrate with champagne, while his grandmother's coffin lowered into the ground. The ache in her chest flared, but beneath it simmered something stronger than pain. She rose slowly, her movements deliberate, and walked past him toward the doorway. Her voice, when it came, was steady as stone. "I'll think about it," she said, cliffhanger. David exhaled in relief, mistaking her composure for concession. But as she closed the door behind him, Margaret's eyes drifted to the cedar chest, tucked in the corner of the room. Inside waited her mother's diary, pages of warnings she suddenly felt ready to read.